Look at Ryan Helen, my son. That is a real soldier. Uncle Richard sneered, tapping his silver fork against his wine glass. His eyes swept over my drab gray suit with ultimate pity. 18 years in the military, and you don't have a single medal to hang on your wall. It's shameful how you cling to the Pentagon's skirt just to stamp scrap paper. You are dirtying that uniform and smearing your father's legacy. Listen to me. You are soft. You were not born to fight. You are just a useless POG. He chuckled. He didn't know that his golden boy Navy SEAL son had just dropped his fork, the blood draining entirely from his face, as he heard me whisper two taboo words. Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I stared at the candle burning in the center of Richard's Thanksgiving table. The flame danced, reflecting in my uncle's smug eyes as he took a sip of his expensive wine. The clinking of the silver cutlery faded. The conversations around the table compressed into a muffled drone, like hearing voices through water. The heat of that small flame pulled my mind away from the Arlington mansion, dragging me backward through time, peeling away the years like old paint. I felt the freezing November wind against my cheeks. I was 12 years old again, standing on the perfectly manicured grass of Arlington National Cemetery. 3 rifle volleys shattered the quiet morning. The sound split through the cold air and echoed off the rows of white headstones stretching in every direction. I stood rigidly next to my mother, my small black shoes planted in the damp grass, watching the honor guard fold the American flag into a crisp triangle. 7 soldiers moved in perfect unison, their white-gloved hands tucking each fold with surgical precision. Not one wrinkle, not one crease out of place. They presented the flag to my mother with both hands. She pressed it against her chest and wept silently, her whole body trembling under her black wool coat. Her tears fell onto the blue fabric of the flag and disappeared into the stars. I didn't cry. My father was a silent intelligence officer, a man who traded his life for a mission no one would ever read about. The details were classified. The coffin was closed. The casket was draped in a flag that represented a country he died protecting, and the country couldn't even tell his daughter how. I held onto his dog tags in my pocket, the cold metal cutting into my small palm, the chain wrapped twice around my fingers, until the links left red imprints in my skin. That was when I felt a heavy hand clap onto my mother's shoulder. Uncle Richard stood right behind us. He didn't wear black. He wore a flashy navy pinstripe suit, a gold watch catching the gray morning light, a silk pocket square blooming from his breast pocket. He was completely out of place among the dark uniforms and grieving faces. 2 rows of soldiers stood at attention. A brigadier general held a folded speech. A chaplain had tears on his cheeks, and Richard stood with his hands in his pockets, shifting his weight from one Italian loafer to the other, looking bored. He looked down at the wooden coffin, the way a man looks at a bad investment, the way he would look at a property listing that didn't meet his margins. That is the price of stubbornness, Richard hissed, leaning close to my mother's ear, but making sure I heard every syllable. If he had listened to me and sold real estate, he wouldn't have rotted in a wooden box for a cheap pension. My mother flinched so hard her shoulders jerked. Her fingers dug into the folded flag until her knuckles turned white. She said absolutely nothing. She lowered her head further, tucking her chin to her chest, surrendering the last scrap of my father's honor to the man who had always despised him. A colonel from my father's unit stepped forward. His jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. He opened his mouth to say something to Richard, his hand already rising from his side. But my mother shook her head. She shook her head at the only person in that cemetery willing to defend her dead husband. The colonel froze his hand, dropping back his eyes, burning with a fury he was forced to swallow. I watched that happen. I watched my mother choose silence over my father's dignity, choose keeping the peace over honoring the man who gave everything. Richard smirked. He adjusted his gold cufflinks and looked around the cemetery with appraising eyes, calculating the value of the surrounding real estate, probably running square footage numbers in his head while standing 10 feet from a casket. I let go of my mother's coat. I stepped directly between Richard and the grave, planting my small shoes into the freshly turned dirt. I stared at his polished Italian leather shoes. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I clenched my father's dog tags until the metal edge drew a thin line of blood across my palm. I made a silent vow over that fresh dirt. I chose my father's path. I would become the shadow that protects the nation. I would carry the weight that Richard was too weak, too vain, too hollow to touch. And I would never, for as long as I lived, beg this man for a single word of approval. I blinked. The freezing wind dissolved back into the warm, cigar-scented air of the present-day dining room. My hand was wrapped around my water glass, my grip tight enough to turn my knuckles white. I brought the glass to my lips and took a slow, measured sip. My face was an unreadable mask, a mask I'd been building for 28 years, one betrayal at a time. Richard was still talking, his voice loud, his laugh louder. I reached for my water glass and set it down with a quiet click. 28 years. He still wore the same smirk. I still carried the same dog tags in the inside pocket of my jacket, the chain worn smooth from years of gripping it in the dark. I adjusted my posture in the dining chair. My gray suit felt heavy against my shoulders, pulling at a spot just below my left collarbone where the fabric rubbed against raised, knotted skin. It was a calculated uniform, deliberately cheap, deliberately forgettable, the kind of suit that made people look past you without a second thought. A weapon of invisibility. Underneath the thin polyester hidden from every person at this table, a jagged 6-inch scar ran from my collarbone down toward my shoulder blade. I took mortar shrapnel in Syria during a covert extraction 3 years into my field career. The blast threw me sideways into a concrete wall. A chunk of hot metal the size of a quarter tore through my tactical vest and embedded itself between my collarbone and my scapula. I hit the ground. My team dragged me behind a blown-out truck while rounds cracked over our heads. I bled out on the floor of a Black Hawk helicopter while a 22-year-old combat medic named Reeves pressed both hands into my chest, screaming for the pilot to fly faster. The rotors shook the stretcher so hard my teeth cracked against each other. Blood soaked through the gauze faster than Reeves could replace it. He kept talking to me. "Stay with me, ma'am. Stay with me." I gripped his wrist and told him to shut up and apply more pressure. I spent 3 months in a military hospital at Landstuhl, Germany, relearning how to raise my right arm above my head. When I finally came home for a mandatory holiday dinner, pale and thin and moving stiffly, this family thought I was just an aging spinster whose hardest task was brewing coffee for generals. I let them believe it. The lie was my fortress. Years ago, when I was 17, I handed my West Point acceptance letter to my mother in Richard's living room. I stood straight, holding the envelope with both hands, the golden crest of the United States Military Academy gleaming under the overhead light. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Her hands reached for it, trembling, her lips already forming the word, "Congratulations." Richard snatched it from her hands before she could read the first line. He pinched the envelope between 2 fingers like it was a piece of junk mail. He glanced at the golden crest, snorted through his nose, and tossed it into the fireplace. My West Point acceptance letter was thrown away by Uncle Richard like scrap paper, while Ryan's football trophy was worshipped on the mantel. I watched the edges of my future curl and blacken in the flames. The gold crest melted into gray ash. My mother stared at the fireplace, but didn't move. She stood there with her empty hands still extended frozen, as if the letter might somehow fly back out of the fire. Richard turned to the mantel and polished Ryan's state championship trophy, with his sleeve adjusting its position directly under the track lighting. "Football," he announced to no one in particular. "Now that builds character." I walked out of his house that day, down the long driveway, past the row of luxury cars, and I shipped off to basic training 2 weeks later without looking back. I never asked my mother why she didn't stop him. I already knew the answer. She couldn't stop a man she was afraid of, and she had been afraid of Richard for as long as I could remember. Richard loved to flaunt his money. Every holiday, every visit, every phone call was an opportunity to remind everyone within earshot of his net worth. He mocked my worn-out 2012 Ford, parked on his pristine driveway. He called it the government mule. He made jokes about my salary in front of his country club friends. He compared my gray suits to thrift store donations. He once asked me in front of his wife and 3 of his business partners whether the Army provided me with a clothing allowance or if I just gave up on my appearance voluntarily. He had no idea about the reality of my finances. Thanks to high-level security clearance bonuses, hazardous duty pay, combat deployment stipends, tax-free income during overseas tours, and aggressive investments managed over 2 decades by a former Treasury Department analyst I served with in Afghanistan. I had enough liquid capital to buy his $1 million Arlington mansion in cash and still keep a healthy 6-figure reserve. My portfolio included government bonds, index funds, and 2 rental properties in Northern Virginia that I purchased under an LLC. I didn't need Richard's handouts. I didn't need his acknowledgement. I chose the old car. I chose the invisible life. Anonymity is the ultimate weapon for an intelligence officer, and I treated every family gathering like a deep cover operation in hostile territory. The gray suit was my ghillie suit. The beat-up Ford was my cover vehicle. The silence was my operational security. I rolled my shoulder forward slightly. The shrapnel scar sent a sharp twinge of pain radiating down my arm, a permanent reminder stitched into my flesh by a war Richard couldn't locate on a map. The medic who saved my life, Reeves, sent me a Christmas card every year with the same message, "Still breathing, ma'am. Thanks to you." I kept every card in a fireproof box under my bed, right next to my father's folded flag. Those cards meant more to me than every dollar in Richard's bank account. Across the table, Ryan adjusted one of the gleaming medals on his dress uniform. He caught me looking and offered a polite, distant nod. He thought I was admiring his ribbons. I was counting them, cross-referencing the campaign markers with deployment timelines I had memorized from classified briefings that crossed my desk. 2 of his decorations were from joint operations that I had personally authorized from a bunker 3 stories underground. He wore the medals. I signed the orders that put him in position to earn them. He didn't know that. Nobody at this table knew that, and I intended to keep it that way. I snapped my attention back to the present. Richard was laughing loudly at his own joke, something about a senator he claimed to know, personally waving his fork in the air for emphasis. I picked up my own fork and took a precise mechanical bite of the cold food in front of me. I swallowed the dry meat without tasting it. My jaw worked automatically. My throat pushed the food down, and my hands returned the fork to the plate. I was a master at infiltration. I had spent months undercover in environments where a single wrong expression could get me killed. Sitting at this table was simply another hostile environment with inferior threats. I kept my breathing steady, counting 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. I scanned the exits out of habit. I noted the position of every person in the room, and I prepared for the next wave of psychological artillery from the man at the head of the table. Only 2 hours before arriving at this dinner, I was buried 3 stories underground in the most secure facility in the Western Hemisphere. The National Military Command Center inside the Pentagon has no windows, no natural light, no sense of day or night. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzz at a frequency that burrows into your skull after the first 12 hours. I spent 36 straight hours in that bunker, staring at satellite feeds, cross-referencing human intelligence reports from 6 different agencies, coordinating a multi-agency counterterrorism strike in the Middle East that involved assets from 3 allied nations. I drank black coffee until my hands shook and my tongue tasted like copper. I gave the green light for a precision airstrike that eliminated a high-value target on the FBI's most wanted list. The confirmation footage played on the center screen. I watched it once, logged the result, and moved on to the next objective. I hadn't slept. I hadn't eaten anything except a stale protein bar I found in the bottom drawer of my desk. My knuckles were still stiff from gripping the edge of the tactical command console for hours, the skin cracked and dry from the recycled air that tasted like old carpet and burnt electronics. I drove my beaten-up Ford through the affluent streets of Arlington, Virginia. The neighborhoods got richer with every block. Manicured hedges, stone pillars, iron gates. I parked my car on Richard's circular driveway, the Ford looking entirely out of place, squeezed between a row of polished black Mercedes-Benz SUVs and a pearl-white Porsche Cayenne. My exhaust pipe coughed once and went silent. I gripped the steering wheel tight, my knuckles turning white for the second time that day. The first time was giving the kill order on a terrorist 12 time zones away. This time was walking into my uncle's house for Thanksgiving dinner. I checked the rearview mirror. My face showed the brutal toll of the command center. Dark circles cut deep under my eyes like bruises. A small vein pulsed at my temple. My lips were chapped from the dry bunker air. I smoothed down my gray suit, pulled the collar straight, stepped out into the cold evening air, and locked the doors behind me. The massive oak front door swung open before I even knocked. Richard stood in the doorway, filling it with his bulk, dressed in a tailored Italian suit dripping with designer labels. A silk pocket square folded into a perfect triangle. Cufflinks that caught the porch light and threw tiny gold reflections across the foyer walls. He looked me up and down, his eyes moving from my scuffed shoes to my wrinkled collar, calculating my worth in real time and finding it at 0. Still that gloomy suit? Helen, you look like a postal worker. He laughed loudly, a booming hollow sound that bounced off the marble floor and the crystal chandelier hanging above his head. He didn't wait for a response. He never waited for responses from people he considered beneath him. He turned on his heel and herded me into the living room, which reeked of thick cigar smoke, expensive bourbon, and the aggressive cologne of a man who needed the entire world to smell him before they saw him. In the center of the room stood Ryan. My 35-year-old cousin held a glass of single malt scotch in one hand. He wore his Navy SEAL dress uniform, the dark fabric pressed to razor-sharp creases, not a single thread out of place. The metals on his chest caught the light of the crystal chandelier, flashing like small mirrors with every breath he took. 4 rows of ribbons, a bronze star with a combat V, a purple heart, jump wings, a sealed trident that gleamed like polished gold. To Richard, Ryan was the ultimate trophy son, living proof that his bloodline produced warriors and winners. Ryan was the mantelpiece, the conversation starter, the human medal Richard wore to every dinner party and country club event. I walked quietly to the edge of the room and took my position against the wall, my back planted firmly in the corner, full view of every entrance and exit, every window, every person. A habit I couldn't break even if I wanted to. I processed Richard's insults exactly how I processed enemy intelligence. Log it, analyze the source, assess the threat level, show 0 reaction, and wait. The dining table was staged like a grotesque theater production. Richard orchestrated the seating with the precision of a man who ranked human beings the way he ranked property listings. He placed Ryan in the center seat of honor, directly under the chandelier, bathed in warm, golden light. He shoved me to the far edge of the table, crammed tightly against a drafty sliding glass door that led to the back patio. The cold November air seeped through the thin glass seal, chilling my left shoulder, right where the shrapnel scar started. Every few seconds, a gust pressed against the door, and the cold bit deeper into the knotted tissue. My mother, Sarah, sat directly across from me. She kept her eyes glued to her empty porcelain plate, tracing the gold rim with the tip of her fingernail in slow, repetitive circles. Her shoulders were hunched, pulled up tight around her ears, her spine curved into a question mark. She looked exactly like a deserting soldier, terrified of being caught in a spotlight. Richard carried the massive turkey to the table on a gleaming silver platter, hoisting it like a trophy. He set it down at the center with a theatrical thud. He picked up the carving knife, making a show of sharpening it with 3 slow, exaggerated swipes of the steel rod, the metallic ring cutting through the room. He sliced the thickest, juiciest cuts of white breast meat and piled them into a small mountain on Ryan's plate. The steam rose from the slices. The skin was golden and crisp. "You need strength, sweetie. You are a warrior protecting the country." Richard cooed, patting Ryan's shoulder with his greasy, free hand. Ryan smiled and cut into his first piece. The platter made its way around the table, each guest helping themselves to generous portions. When it finally reached my end of the table, Richard intercepted it. He used his serving spoon to scrape a single bone-dry wing and a spoonful of cold green beans onto my plate. The beans landed with a wet slap against the porcelain. He dropped the spoon back onto the platter with a sharp clank. "Eat, Helen. Sitting at a desk all day doesn't burn as many calories as Ryan out on the battlefield anyway." He declared loud enough for every person in the room to hear. 2 of his business partners at the far end smirked into their wine glasses. I stared at the dry meat. The hunger from 36 hours of fasting clawed at my stomach, twisting hard, my body running on cortisol and black coffee fumes. But my face remained carved from stone. I picked up my fork and cut the wing with slow, deliberate precision, separating the scant meat from the bone in 2 clean movements. Ryan's closest battlefield was a routine training rotation in Germany, where the most dangerous thing he faced was a hangover from the base NCO club. My desk was the iron chair bolted to the floor of the National Military Command Center, where I authorized the operations his unit carried out, where I held the lives of hundreds of soldiers in the space between my thumb and the green light button. "The food is delicious, Uncle Richard," I stated evenly, placing a sliver of dry turkey in my mouth. Lying is a standard peacekeeping tactic. I had told bigger lies to more dangerous men. Across the table, my mother obsessively chopped her green beans into microscopic pieces, her knife scraping against the porcelain plate in a frantic rhythm. She refused to meet my eyes. Her left hand twitched off the table, reaching toward my arm across the white tablecloth. I saw her fingers extend for half a second, stretching across the empty space between us. Then she pulled them back into her own lap, curled them into a fist, and resumed cutting. That twitch was the closest thing to protection my mother had offered me in 28 years. Her silence was a knife shoved squarely in my back, and her retracted hand was the twist. Richard poured himself another glass of wine, the red liquid glugging into the crystal. He leaned back in his oversized leather chair at the head of the table, his belly pressing against the edge, his tie loosening. He swirled the wine, watched it catch the candlelight, and took a long, satisfied sip. He was just warming up. "I heard the Pentagon is cutting administrative staff. Are you worried, Helen? I'm sure Ryan can pull some strings and get you a job answering phones. At least you'll be near real soldiers." The table went dead silent. Every fork stopped moving. Every glass paused in midair. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at me sideways, with a look that carried just enough guilt to prove he knew his father had gone too far, but not enough spine to stop it. He knew I held an officer's rank. He had seen my military ID once briefly at a gas station 2 years ago, when I pulled it out instead of my driver's license by mistake. He noticed the rank insignia. He opened his mouth to say something to his father. His jaw moved. Then he shut it, just as quickly, pressing his lips together and reaching for his scotch instead. He took a long sip. He liked the spotlight too much to turn it off, even if the spotlight was powered by my humiliation. Richard wasn't done. He never was. He set down his wine glass and picked up his fork, pointing it directly at me, the tines aimed at my sternum. "What do you do at the Pentagon? Organize paper clips for the generals." He laughed, leaning over the table until I could smell the wine on his breath, mixed with cigar ash and the heavy musk of his cologne. "Don't be shy, Helen. The world needs cleaners, so real heroes like Ryan can do the mission." Cold-hardened anger flooded my veins. It didn't burn. It froze. It crystallized into something sharp and precise behind my sternum, the way adrenaline crystallizes before a firefight, turning the world into clean lines and simple math. My mother kept her head down, sawing at a green bean that had already been reduced to a paste on her plate. Her complicity snapped the final thread binding me to this family. Then Richard turned in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and pointed his fork directly at the framed photo of my father, hanging on the wall above the mantel, right next to Ryan's high school football trophy. He jabbed the fork at my father's face. "You are dirtying the uniform and smearing your father's memory by playing the role of a paper pusher." I looked down at my hands. They were flat on the white tablecloth fingers, spread motionless. Then muscle memory took over. My right hand instinctively rotated fingers, wrapping around the heavy steak knife beside my plate. I gripped it in a reverse tactical hold, designed for close-quarters combat, the blade running down along my inner forearm, concealed against my wrist, the handle locked tight in my palm. My knuckles turned bone white. I stopped looking at Richard. My eyes detached from his face completely and began scanning the room in rapid, mechanical succession. 2 exits. Front door, 12 steps, 3 seconds, to the lock unlocked. Sliding glass door behind me, latch at hip level, 2-second release. A blind spot behind the heavy curtains on the east wall, large enough to conceal one person. Clear sight line to every chair. I cataloged the positions of every person at the table, the way I catalog combatants in a hostile compound. My breathing dropped to a shallow controlled rhythm barely visible. My heart rate slowed from 68 beats per minute to a steady icy 54, the same pulse I held when I lay in a concealed position for 6 hours outside a compound in Yemen, waiting for confirmation to execute. I entered the kill box. Across the table, Ryan froze. His trained seal eyes caught the micro movements instantly. First, the knife grip. His jaw clenched. He saw my fingers rotate into the reverse hold, and a flash of recognition crossed his face, the kind of recognition that only comes from thousands of hours of combat training. That was not a dinner grip. That was an engagement grip. Then the exit sweep. He watched my pupils track left to right in a precise mechanical arc that had nothing to do with looking at the decorations. He saw me catalog the front door, the sliding door, the curtains, then the breathing shift. He watched my chest stop rising and falling. He didn't see his boring cousin anymore. He didn't see the pale woman in the gray suit, who he thought spent her days filing paperwork and scheduling conference calls. He saw an apex predator locking down a room with the calm, ruthless efficiency of someone who had done it hundreds of times in places where the stakes were measured in body counts. His posture stiffened. His spine snapped straight in the chair like a steel rod had been shoved through it. The wine glass hovered inches from his mouth. He set it down onto the table with a loud, deliberate thud, the scotch sloshing over the rim and pooling on the tablecloth. The color left his face in a slow drain starting at his forehead and pulling down through his cheeks and jaw until his skin matched the white linen. His voice dropped an octave, carrying the heavy, authoritative weight of a military officer recognizing a clear and present threat. "Dad, shut your mouth." Richard looked at his son, stunned. His fork was still hanging in the air, pointed at my father's photograph. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish pulled out of water. Ryan ignored him completely. He leaned over the table, pushing his plate aside with the back of his hand, the silverware clattering. He locked eyes with me, and I could see the assessment running behind his pupils. He was cataloging every detail, running it against his training, matching it against the behavioral profile of someone operating at a level far above anything he had encountered in his chain of command. The knife grip, the breathing, the exit sweep, the 1,000-yard focus in my eyes that had nothing to do with this dining room and everything to do with years of operating in the darkest, most classified corners of the world. "Drop the act. Helen." Ryan commanded, his voice tight with sudden adrenaline, his right hand gripping the edge of the table hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "That knife grip, the way you just swept the corners of this room, no administrative clerk does that." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His pupils were dilated. His breathing had quickened. "What is your call sign?" The silence in the dining room was suffocating. I could hear the candle flame hissing on the table, the wax pooling and crackling around the wick. I could hear Richard's shallow, confused breathing. I could hear my own heartbeat steady and slow as a metronome. I relaxed my fingers one by one, peeling them off the handle of the steak knife. I set the knife down on the tablecloth, parallel to my plate, the blade perfectly aligned with the edge. I picked up my linen napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth with slow, deliberate precision, folded it twice into a perfect square, and placed it beside my plate. I straightened my spine. I locked my eyes onto my cousin. "You really want to know, Major?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, carrying the absolute authority of a commanding officer delivering a final, irrevocable order. "Wraith 9. Ryan flinched violently, like a man grabbing a live electrical wire. The fork slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against his plate, bouncing once, and landing on the tablecloth with a muffled thud. All the remaining color drained from his face. The arrogant golden boy vanished. In his place stood a soldier, who had just realized he was sitting across the table from a command authority so far above his pay grade that his entire career, every medal, every deployment, every commendation fit inside one of my filing cabinets. Ryan sprang up from his chair. The chair scraped backward across the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent screech. He took a mechanical step backward and snapped into a rigid position of attention, his arms locked at his sides, his chin tucked, his heels pressed together, his chest pushed out. Pure, unadulterated panic flared in his eyes. Richard sat frozen, his wine glass suspended halfway to his mouth, his thick fingers wrapped around the stem. He looked at his son standing at rigid military attention in the middle of a Thanksgiving dinner. He looked at me, still seated, still calm, still in absolute control. "What is this circus?" Richard giggled nervously, the sound thin and cracking like ice under pressure. "What the hell is a Wraith 9? An email password." "Shut up, Dad!" Ryan roared. The sound shook the chandelier crystals above the table. 2 wine glasses rattled against each other. A candle flame bent sideways from the force of his voice. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his hand trembling visibly, his index finger rigid and accusatory, but not at me. At his father. "Do you know who you just mocked? That is the nation's highest level intelligence asset. She holds the authority to order airstrikes and deploy entire carrier strike groups. My commanding officer has to schedule an appointment just to speak to her staff. And you called her a pog. Richard shrank back into his expensive leather chair. His face turned an ashen gray, the color of old newspaper left in the rain. The wine glass tilted in his hand, and a thin stream of red liquid spilled onto the white tablecloth, spreading slowly like a wound that couldn't be staunched. The illusion of his superiority shattered into a million pieces on the hardwood floor, right next to the crumbs of the turkey. He rationed to me, like scraps thrown to a stray dog. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were the tears of a woman who had just watched her dead husband's legacy validated in the most devastating way possible in the living room of the man who had spent 3 decades spitting on it. She gripped the folded napkin in her lap with both hands, her knuckles white, staring at me like she was seeing her daughter for the first time in 28 years. I stood up. I buttoned the center button of my cheap gray suit. The same gray suit Richard mocked every holiday. The same gray suit that had walked through the blast doors of the most powerful military command center on Earth. I stayed silent for 18 years, not because I was afraid of you. I said to Richard, my voice as cold and flat as glacial runoff, but because the operational security of the United States military is more important than your sick ego. You need Ryan to be a hero to cover up your own insecurities. But you do not get to use my father's legacy as a joke. I pushed my chair in, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table. I walked toward the front door, my steps measured, and even my heels clicking against the hardwood in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. I paused at the threshold, one hand on the brass doorknob, and turned back toward the table. Richard sat motionless, his mouth hanging open, his fingers still wrapped around the tilted wine glass. Ryan remained locked at rigid attention, his eyes forward, his breathing shallow and controlled. By the way, the turkey was dry. I don't answer phones, Uncle Richard. When I make them ring, generals have to pick up. I opened the door. The freezing winter air hit my face, and for the first time in 18 years, it tasted like freedom. Have you ever had to walk away from a family member who constantly belittled your worth, only to finally prove them wrong? Please like this video and share your experience in the comments below. We carry these scars together, but we do not have to carry them in silence. I stepped out into the freezing night, pulling my phone from my pocket. I hit the encrypted speed dial, the screen flashing a single green bar, indicating a secure connection. This is Wraith. I am en route. ETA 20 minutes. I ordered. My breath formed white clouds in the dark air, each one dissolving as fast as it appeared. I fired up my old Ford, the engine coughing twice before catching, and I sped away from Richard's mansion. I didn't check the rearview mirror. The family I was leaving behind didn't deserve a backward glance. The family I was driving toward needed me alive and sharp. 20 minutes later, I walked through the heavy blast doors of the National Military Command Center. The Marine guards at the checkpoint spotted me, recognized my face, and immediately snapped to attention. They saluted. I returned the salute without breaking stride. Inside the Situation Room, the air hit me like a wall of cold static. The massive screens displayed a live satellite feed of a dark, narrow street in Kabul. Green-tinted thermal signatures moved in clusters between buildings. Gunfire crackled faintly over the speakers. Our operative Echo 4 was compromised. He had been ambushed during a covert surveillance mission and was pinned down inside a residential compound, taking fire from 3 directions. His extraction window was closing by the minute. 2 officers looked up when I entered. Relief flooded their faces. I tossed my coat onto the back of a chair and grabbed a headset, fitting it over my ear in one practiced motion. "Status," I demanded. A major stepped forward and briefed me quickly, pointing to the tactical display with a laser pointer. The Quick Reaction Force designated Alpha Team was 5 minutes out in armored vehicles. He recommended a Hellfire missile strike from a Reaper drone circling at 12,000 feet to level the insurgent compound before the ground team moved in. Standard operating procedure. Clean, fast. Minimal risk to our soldiers. I stepped closer to the screen, narrowing my eyes at the thermal imaging. The compound walls glowed white-hot from sustained small arms fire. The insurgent positions were clear, clustered at the north and east walls. But right against the exterior wall of the target building, pressed together in a tight huddle, I spotted 3 small, glowing heat signatures. They were too small to be adults, too still to be combatants. They were children huddled against the wall, trapped between the firefight and the concrete. Children, I stated. The room went dead silent. The major lowered his laser pointer. Every officer in the bunker turned to face me. Abort airstrike. Alpha Team, you are cleared for close quarters combat. Avoid crossfire. Bring our guy home. We do not trade civilian lives. The bunker plunged into a suffocating silence. For 12 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the sporadic crackling burst of gunfire over the tactical radio net, each burst followed by the hiss of static and the faint, distant shouts of soldiers calling targets. The major stood behind me, his laser pointer hanging at his side, his jaw locked shut. A female lieutenant at the communications console pressed her headset tighter against her ears, transcribing every fragment of radio chatter in shorthand on a yellow legal pad. I stood with my arms crossed, staring at the screen, watching the green thermal signatures of Alpha Team move through the compound room by room. My heart beat in perfect disciplined rhythm, 62 beats per minute, the same rate I maintained during interrogations, during briefings with the Joint Chiefs, during every moment that demanded absolute clarity. The 3 small heat signatures against the wall hadn't moved. They were still there, still pressed together in their tight huddle, alive, untouched. At the 9-minute mark, a burst of heavy automatic fire erupted over the radio, followed by 2 sharp detonations. The lieutenant's pen stopped moving. I didn't flinch. I watched the screen. 3 minutes later, the radio squawked. A voice came through sharp and clear, cutting through the static like a blade. Target secure. Echo 4 extracted. 3 civilians unharmed. No collateral damage. A collective breath released across the command center. Someone behind me pressed their palms flat on the console and exhaled through their teeth. Someone else whispered a prayer under their breath. The lieutenant set her pen down and closed her eyes for 2 seconds. I nodded once, my expression unchanging. Heavy footsteps approached from behind. General Hayes walked up, his silver stars gleaming on his shoulders, and dropped a thick manila folder onto my console. The slap of paper cut through the residual tension. "You took a risk, Colonel," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of a man who had sent thousands of soldiers into harm's way and understood the cost of every decision. But it was the exact right call. The board was unanimous. He flipped open the folder, revealing official Pentagon letterhead stamped with the gold seal of the Department of Defense. "Congratulations, Colonel Cook." I gripped the edge of the paper. The ink was still fresh on my official promotion orders. I earned this with blood, sleepless nights, mortar shrapnel buried in my shoulder, and silent, thankless sacrifice that no one at that Thanksgiving table would ever comprehend. I folded the orders carefully and placed them in my inner jacket pocket right next to my father's dog tags, metal against metal. I had real work to do. In military tactics, radio silence is a protocol used to disorient and blind the enemy, to cut off their intelligence feed and leave them groping in the dark, unable to predict your movements or assess your strength. I applied that exact protocol to my family. For 18 months, I did not answer a single call. I did not reply to a single text message. I did not attend a single dinner, birthday, holiday, or funeral. I vanished from their radar completely, as if I had been redeployed to a location with no postal code. Richard sent frantic messages, each one deploying a different manipulation tactic, escalating through his entire playbook. First came the flattery. "Helen, we are so proud of you. The family misses you." Then came the demands, the tone shifting to the voice he used with contractors who missed deadlines. "You owe this family a visit. You are being selfish and dramatic." Then came the guilt offensive, the most dangerous weapon in any manipulator's arsenal. He invoked my mother's name like a hostage negotiator, deploying a loved one's voice. "Your mother is not well, Helen. She needs you. Are you really going to abandon her, the way your father abandoned us for the military?" He weaponized her health like a live grenade designed to hook my conscience. I read each message once. I analyzed the tactic, I logged it, and I pressed block on every platform, every phone number, every email address, one by one, systematically, the way you clear rooms in a hostile building. Richard tried alternate routes. He had his wife call from her phone. I blocked it. He had his secretary send a formal letter on his company letterhead requesting a family reconciliation meeting at a neutral location. I shredded it. He showed up unannounced at the Pentagon visitor's entrance, dressed in his finest suit, demanding to see me. The front desk sergeant informed him that Colonel Cook was unavailable and that civilian visitors without prior security clearance authorization could not enter the building. Richard stood in that lobby for 45 minutes, according to the security log I reviewed later, before a military police escort walked him back to his car. He never tried the front door again. It was time for me to stop drinking poison just to keep the surface of the family looking peaceful. On the day of my official promotion ceremony at the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, I stood at attention in my full dress uniform. The deep blue fabric was pressed to knife-edge creases. Every ribbon and medal I had earned in the shadows, in the bunkers in the Black Hawk helicopters, in the classified operations that would never appear in any newspaper, was finally pinned where it belonged in rows across my chest. My mother walked in first. She wore a simple black dress and held a small clutch purse with both hands, her fingers trembling against the clasp. Her eyes were red. She had been crying in the car. Behind her walked Ryan. He wore his khaki service uniform cleaned and pressed, no Scotch glass, no arrogance, no spotlight-chasing grin. When he looked at me standing at attention under the flags, there was zero arrogance left in his eyes. There was only the absolute, unbreakable respect that exists between soldiers who understand the weight of the badge, the cost of the uniform, and the silence required to carry both with honor. Ryan stepped forward and pinned the silver eagle onto my right shoulder, his fingers steady and precise. My mother stepped forward and pinned the left eagle, her fingers shaking badly, tears streaming down her cheeks in two silent lines. Ryan leaned in close to my ear and whispered. He told me he had banned his father from attending the ceremony. He made one phone call the night before and said 5 words. "You are not coming, Dad." Richard screamed through the phone so loud that Ryan had to hold it away from his ear. Richard threatened to cut him out of the will. Richard called him ungrateful, called him a traitor to the family name. Richard begged, his voice cracking into a register Ryan had never heard before, the sound of a man losing control of the only currency he had left, his ability to command his own son. Ryan hung up the phone, set his alarm for 5 a.m., pressed his uniform, and drove to the Pentagon without losing a single minute of sleep. Later that afternoon, I returned to my private office on the 3rd floor. The hallway was quiet, the fluorescent lights humming their constant flat note. I pushed open my office door and stopped in the threshold. Sitting squarely on my desk was a massive, ostentatious basket of exotic flowers wrapped in gold ribbons and shimmering cellophane that crinkled in the air conditioning. The smell hit me immediately, a sickeningly sweet, overpowering perfume that had no place in a military building. It smelled like a funeral arrangement, designed by someone who had never attended a real funeral. Tucked into the ribbons was a premium card, cream-colored heavy stock with a gold border, and Richard's handwriting in thick black ink. It read, "Congratulations on finally doing something for yourself." I stared at the card. I did not touch it. It was a Trojan horse wrapped in the illusion of family affection, a final pathetic attempt to diminish my achievement by framing my 18-year military career as a selfish hobby. As if the shrapnel scar was a tattoo I chose. As if the sleepless years were a phase. As if the 3 children in Kabul I saved last month were a personal indulgence. I didn't touch the card. I didn't smell the flowers. I didn't give the basket a second glance. I walked behind my desk, sat down in my chair, and pressed the intercom button with one finger. "Captain," I called out to my assistant. He entered the room immediately, crisp and alert, standing at parade rest. I pointed a single finger at the basket. "Pack it up and mark it. Recipient refused. Return to sender." The captain didn't ask a single question. He lifted the basket off my desk with both hands and walked out, closing the door behind him. I opened my laptop, pulled up the day's intelligence briefing, and began reading. I was no longer the little girl standing in the dirt at Arlington National Cemetery, seeking validation from a coward in a pinstripe suit. I controlled the battlefield now. My perimeter was secure, my boundaries were fortified, and Richard was permanently exiled to the other side of a wall he would never breach. Every war eventually reaches its end. Some end with treaties signed in marble halls, some end with silence, some end with a phone call at 3 a.m. that changes everything. Months after the promotion ceremony, my phone vibrated on my nightstand. I open my eyes in the dark instantly, alert my hand reaching for the phone with the reflexive speed of someone who has been woken by crisis calls for 2 decades. The screen showed Ryan's name. I answered, pressing the phone to my ear without saying a word. His voice was heavy, stripped of all energy, flattened into the monotone of a soldier delivering a casualty notification. Uncle Richard had been diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Metastatic. Inoperable. The oncologist at Walter Reed gave him weeks, maybe a month, if the treatment slowed the progression. The man who spent his entire life hoarding wealth, collecting luxury properties like trophies, and stealing valor from people who actually bled for their country was out of time. No amount of money, no real estate deal, no designer suit could buy his way out of this final, non-negotiable closing. Ryan didn't ask me to come. He didn't plead. He didn't manipulate. He simply delivered the intelligence report clean and clear, the way one officer briefs another on a developing situation. I hung up the phone. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the clock on my wall tick through the silence. Then I reached for my keys on the nightstand and swung my legs out of bed. I walked into the private room at Walter Reed Medical Center, wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a plain black jacket, no uniform, no medals, no armor. The room smelled of antiseptic, and something underneath it, something stale and organic, that the chemicals couldn't mask. The arrogant mogul was gone. The tailored Italian suits were gone. The gold watch was gone. The booming laugh that used to fill every room like a weapon was gone. Richard was nothing but a fragile skeleton, sinking into the white hospital sheets, his skin the color of old candle wax, translucent and paper-thin. Tubes ran into his arms, from 3 different IV bags hanging on a metal pole. A heart monitor beat beside him in a slow, irregular rhythm that sounded like a countdown, reaching its final digits. When his sunken eyes found me standing in the doorway, he began to weep. The tears leaked from the corners of his eyes and ran down the hollows of his cheeks. His lips moved before any sound came out. He choked out his final pathetic confession in fragments, his voice crackling like dry paper crumbling in a fist. He said my name 3 times before he could form a complete sentence. He admitted he hated me because I was exactly like my father. A real hero who didn't need applause. A person whose silent strength, whose very existence in the same room exposed his own utter uselessness to anyone paying attention. He told me he never served a day in uniform. He told me he tried to enlist when he was 19 and the recruiter rejected him for flat feet and a heart murmur. He spent the rest of his life overcompensating, buying what he couldn't earn, collecting trophies through his son that he couldn't win himself. He was terrified every single day that I would outshine his son and prove to the entire world that Richard himself was nothing more than a hollow man in an expensive suit, a coward who built his empire on the backs of people he looked down on, because looking down was the only way he could feel tall. Every insult he had ever thrown at me was a shield. Every time he tore me down at that dining table, he was desperately trying to build himself up high enough that no one could see how small he really was. I stood at the foot of his bed, my hands clasped behind my back. I looked down at my greatest enemy. He was 80 pounds lighter than the man who carved the turkey. His cheeks were sunken into dark cavities. His hands, the same hands that snatched my West Point letter and threw it into the fire, trembled on the white sheets like dry leaves in a gutter. I held absolute emotional power over his final moments. I could have turned my back and let him die in terror, carrying the weight of every cruelty he ever inflicted, every letter he burned, every meal he rationed, every word he used like a blade. But a good commander knows exactly when a campaign is over. Prolonging the assault after victory is secured is not strength. It is waste. I forgive you, Richard. I stated quietly, my voice devoid of anger, devoid of warmth, devoid of everything except the final absolute authority of someone who has already won. Not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry your poison for another day. I turned and walked out of the room. My shoes clicked against the hospital tile steady, and even the same rhythm that had carried me out of his mansion, out of his orbit, out of his control forever. I didn't look back. He took his last breath a few days later, alone in that room, surrounded by machines, and the silence he had spent his whole life trying to fill with noise. I skipped his funeral. I skipped the loud, expensive choreographed production that Richard would have staged for himself. The eulogies written by business partners who feared him, not loved him. The flower arrangements that cost more than most families spend on groceries in a month. Instead, I stood on the balcony of my Washington, D.C. apartment holding a glass of red wine. The apartment was small by Richard's standards, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a gas stove I actually used, bookshelves lined with intelligence manuals, and dog-eared copies of Sun Tzu and Marcus Aurelius. It was mine. Every square foot of it was earned, paid for, and chosen. Below me, the Potomac River flowed quietly into the evening, the water dark and smooth, carrying the last copper light of the setting sun downstream toward the Chesapeake. A pair of rowers cut through the water in perfect synchronization, their oars dipping and rising without a sound. My phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. One line. "Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like." A soldier who had finally put down his father's trophy and picked up his own compass. I thought about texting back. I decided the silence between us said everything that needed saying. I set the phone down on the iron railing. The past was entirely closed, every wound cataloged, processed, and filed in a cabinet I would never open again. I looked up at the clear sky, feeling the weight of the silver eagles on my shoulders, the dog tags resting against my chest, warm from my own body heat. I don't need to be the sun to shine. I am the shield in the dark. I am Helen Cook. I am Wraith 9, and I am entirely free. Forgiveness isn't about letting the person who hurt you off the hook. It's about setting your own soul free from their prison. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, how did you finally break free from the toxic people in your life?